In this video, I'm going to talk about different password rules and their impact on how secure your password really is. I'm going to give examples of good rules, some rules that can cause inconvenience for little benefit, and at least one stupid rule. These are subjective, so you may not agree with me, but even if you don't, it will hopefully make you think when creating your company password rules or creating your own password. Firstly, I'd say that passwords are not necessarily the best way to protect your logins. There are alternatives that are completely remove the need for passwords, or where passwords are used, you may want to add multi-factor authentication. I've created separate videos on this already, so I won't be going into detail on those. Also note that whilst I use the word password, this is often referred to as a passphrase, particularly when systems encourage longer length passwords. Most of these rules apply equally, whether it's referred to as a password or a passphrase. Passphrase is perhaps a better term for users, as it encourages them to use longer phrases, but most systems still say password, so they're going to be more familiar with that term. First, here are some of the problems with passwords. This will help with the context later, when I give examples of password rules. I've referred to these as attack vectors. Really, we're just looking at ways a user's password could be compromised. Most of the problems are a result of human memory. As a species, we are not very good at remembering things, especially things that don't have a pattern. To counter this with passwords, we try and choose passwords that are easy to remember. We may try and reuse passwords. And if we can't remember them, perhaps because of the complex rules, then we may resort to writing them down. Some people have been known to stick these to post-it notes or left in a notepad which somebody else could access. Or we may forget the password, resulting in an inability to use the service. And sometimes people share passwords. This could be by design, such as having a shared login for a third-party site, or perhaps on an immediate need, such as someone forgets their password and a colleague lets them borrow their password. The latter is obviously bad. Shared passwords by design can be a problem, especially as it removes the accountability aspect, but it can sometimes be the better of two evils. I'm not going to go into details in this video, but user management across third parties can have its own difficulties. Passwords can be guessed. There are the obvious guesses, such as the word password, but if the password is related to something or someone the user knows, it may be possible to guess, perhaps the name of a spouse or a pet. They can also be stolen or acquired. Network sniffing, shoulder surfing, keyboard logger, phishing, hacking, such as stealing the passwords from another system, dumpster diving, searching through rubbish bins or skips. Another method is brute force attacks. As a result, there are different password rules which aim to protect passwords, but the rules cannot protect against all these problems, and in some cases, rules attempting to control one risk may increase one of the other risks. To research these, I've used a number of different organisations. I won't compare the different organisations for every rule, but I've put some of my sources here as suggestions of where to get more information. The first ones are NIST recommendations. This is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, a US organisation with rules that are often a requirement for US federal agencies. Specifically NIST SP 800-63B, which is Digital Identity Guidelines. And this makes recommendations on various aspects of security. They also have a frequently asked questions, which is provided in this link here. And these links will be included in the description as well. PCI DSS, PCI Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, particularly version 3.2.1. These are particularly important if you take credit card payments, and particularly when handling their payments through your own systems. I've used the RSI Security website for this link, as it gives a good overview of some of the requirements from PCI DSS. I've used the UK National Cyber Security Centre as well. It's more of a white paper than a formal recommendation or requirement, but it's one of my favourite resources. They explain the rationale about why those rules are in place. Microsoft, they provide a recommendation for O365 systems. And for Linux, it's difficult to give a single source as there's a disparity between the different guides. But one of the things, the Red Hat Linux refers quite a lot to the NIST guidelines. So in some respect that's already covered, but there's a guide there as well if you want to use that. And finally, I've also asked Google Bard. Bard is an AI chatbot, Google's alternative to ChatGPT. I've already created a video about that on my other channel, Penguin Tutor. It gave some interesting answers, some agreeing and some disagreeing with my own thoughts. So these links are all included in the description if you'd like to look them up yourself. We'll look at the rules and we'll start with a controversial example, maximum age or password expiry. How long should it be, and should passwords even expire? The reason for passwords expiring is that the chance of it being disclosed or discovered increases over time. So forcing a password change will mean that the user changes their password. But what about the downside? It means that the user needs to choose another password and remember it. As we've said, that's not something us humans are particularly good at. Here's what some organisations say. NIST recommendations say that verifiers should not require memorised secrets to be changed arbitrarily, i.e. periodically. However, verifiers shall force a change if there is evidence of compromise of the authenticator, which makes sense. Microsoft recommendation for Microsoft O365 passwords says, set an individual user's password to never expire. However, PCI DSS, the payment card industry, Data Security Standard version 3.2.1 says that passwords must expire every 90 days. This is important if you handle credit card payments which are saved onto your own system, as you may need to comply with these. So, with the contradictory advice, which is best? The main benefit of not needing to change your password is that it means you can remember that password without needing to write it down. This is particularly important if this is your main system password, or for a password manager, as it will need to be in a form that can be remembered rather than stored securely. So, allowing users to keep their password without needing to change it regularly reduces the risk that they will write it down or forget it. The advantage to changing the password is that the risk of the password being compromised increases over time. The counter-argument to this is that if someone is able to find your password, they're not going to wait until the password expires to use it. They're going to use it straight away. So what benefit does changing your password after 90 days have if they've already compromised your system after 45 days? Also, looking at human nature, and when forced to change the password, if a user has already put a number at the end of their password, they may just increase that number. Having password 1 changed to password 2 or password 3 doesn't make the password any more secure. There are some cases where forced password changes may be useful, particularly with shared accounts, or where someone has lent their password to another user. There is also the risk that if you used a password on a different system that has been compromised, then forcing a password change could help. But because the attacker would have up to 90 days to try the password, there is only a little advantage there. For most users, with regard to their main login password, then I don't believe that forcing a password change adds additional security. One rule that I really think shouldn't be applied is minimum password age. In fact, why would you ever need a minimum password age? The reason that some implement it as this way is to prevent users from reusing their password when forced to change the password. I've already said why I don't agree with forcing users to periodically change their password anyway. But one thing is that when forced to change their password, some users will try and keep their old password that they already know. If you block that from being used, then users can get around this by changing their password to a temporary password and then changing it back to their original password. By putting a minimum age, then it prevents them from doing that. For one, this is trying to force user behaviour without making the password more secure. It's likely to infuriate the user, and potentially they can just change one character anyway, as I showed previously. The real reason I think this is a stupid rule is that it can result in a compromised password that can't be changed. For example, you sit down at a computer in a public place, library, coffee shop, wherever you may need to log in to an important system. Your password has expired, and so you are forced to change it. You enter your new password and then turn around and see that someone is looking over your shoulder and has seen your password. You move away, try and change that password, and it won't let you. Your password has already been changed today, so it won't let you change it for 2 more days. If that person managed to see your password, or even just part of it, they now have 2 days to break into your system and do whatever they want. They can even change the password straight after the 2 days runs out, and you're locked out of your system. If your system has an option for minimum password age, then don't use it. It doesn't add any additional security and could make your system less secure. The next one, again with differing opinions, is rules on password complexity. These can include mandating lowercase and uppercase letters, numbers, and special characters. Some systems may even restrict on duplicate characters, especially when adjacent. When we look at forcing increased complexity, then they can make it harder for the user to create a password. When the rules include mandatory special characters, that can be a problem when the user needs to enter the password on a touchscreen device, such as a mobile phone, or when using a different keyboard layout. For example, English language keyboards are unlikely to have many accented characters, and even when they have the same language, special characters are often missing or moved. For example, you won't find the UK monetary pound sign on US keyboards. When we look at the possible attack vectors, whilst complex rules could help against some of them, it does not help with many of the vulnerabilities, such as keyloggers, phishing attacks, or any other ways of stealing the password. If the results result in a user writing down their password to remember it, then it can make it less secure. With the example shown here, the word password with some letters swapped for dollar symbols and the O swapped for a 0, it meets the rules of upper and lowercase. It has 2 special characters and a digit, but clearly this is not a secure password and not one I'd recommend using. Looking at some of the guidelines, PCI DSS require both letters and numbers, but does not mandate special characters. They do say that you should disallow previous passwords. NIST say you should not impose composition rules, although it's a recommendation rather than a requirement. They do instead recommend using a blacklist of common passwords and increasing the password length. I'll come to this shortly. So looking at the minimum password length, in terms of number of characters, and increasing that is a good idea. The minimum length specified by PCI is 7, although this may be better as an 8-character minimum, as that's a more reasonable length to remember, but lets you create a reasonable password that is not easy to brute force attack. Longer minimums can work, but they can also make it harder to remember the passwords, so you don't want to make the minimum too long. NIST doesn't give a fixed minimum and instead recommends choosing a length based on the threat model. Interestingly, Windows recommends a minimum length of 14 characters, but then allows a short 5-character PIN code for the user logins for home users. Note, however, that the PIN can only be used locally, i.e. not online, and only for the specific hardware that has been authorized, using the Trusted Platform module. So it's kind of part of a multi-factor authentication rather than just using standard password authentication. So that's why they say that is more secure. Some systems impose a maximum password length as well. This can be used in a way that the system can perform checks on the maximum length to prevent buffer overflows. But it only really makes sense when the rules allow for the users to create a reasonably lengthy password. I've had to create passwords for a system that would only allow a maximum of 12 characters, and this doesn't make sense to me as it prevents combining multiple words together and is just too short, and less than some organisations recommend as a minimum. It's also worth noting that when stored in memory or a database, etc., then the hashing algorithm will likely use the same number of characters when storing the password, regardless of how long it is. For example, the password hash on a Raspberry Pi, including the seed, etc., is 73 characters, which does not change if the password is longer or shorter. NIST only recommend limiting the length of passwords where it becomes computationally expensive to process the passwords, i.e. if your hashing algorithm is taking a long time to process it and it's putting a high load on your system. One of the things that can pose a risk is where a null or default password is used. This is particularly common on networking hardware devices such as routers and firewalls. Whilst this is convenient for equipment manufacturers to not need to provide specific passwords, this is something that is often used by attackers looking to get into a device. This is something the Red Hat guide refers to as stating that Red Hat Enterprise Linux does not ship with default passwords. It's also been implemented by other manufacturers, including Raspberry Pi, who removed the default password on new versions of the operating system. One way to remove a default password is to force the user or administrator to set a password when first logging in. Or another good alternative is providing a unique password for each device, such as home routers that often have a unique default password on a sticker on the back of the device. So with conflicting recommendations about what makes a good password, what is the solution? Ideally, users should be encouraged to use passphrases rather than short passwords, creating longer phrases rather than creating complex rules to try and force them to make hard to remember passwords. And a major way to reduce the risk is by implementing multi-factor authentication or perhaps certificate-based authentication. If you still rely on just a password for authentication, then apply the rules as appropriate, but use your own judgment. Which rules are ones that will actually make the password safer and which are most suitable for your environment. I'd also recommend involving the users in this through user education. Rather than trying to force complex passwords through rules, explain to users about how they can create a secure passphrase instead. Better to help them to be secure rather than force them through complex rules. Remember, this is just my opinion, based on the guidelines from the organisations I mentioned earlier. If you already have company rules that you have to follow, or if you need to meet certain criteria by regulatory bodies, then you may need to follow those, even if they don't necessarily make the password more secure. Thanks for watching. I hope you've found something useful in that. If so, please give it a like. Please subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so, and I look forward to seeing you on a future video.